Around the World segment tonight, it turns out two can play the diplomat expulsion game. After the U.S. and 14 other Western nations expelled Russian diplomats from our nation in response to the Russians poisoning a former Russian spy with an internationally banned nerve agent, the Russians announced they will be kicking out 60 American diplomats from their country and closing the American consulate in St. Petersburg. With me now, geopolitical risk strategist John Sitilides. John, good to see you.
Good to see you, Liz.
All right, John, we have sort of a tit-for-tat situation going on here between certainly the Russians and the United States, although there are some other Western countries that are also in on this. 60 U.S. diplomats now expelled from Russia. They have to leave by the end of the week. What does this mean?
It means that we're in a very, very challenging phase in the U.S.-Russia relationship. And I think this is really the beginning of what's going to be an arduous process for many years to come, unfortunately, especially in the wake of Vladimir Putin's victory in the presidential election, 77% in a fraudulent election there, Liz. But this is going to be a major contest now between two great geopolitical rivals. Remember that Vladimir Putin said 10 years ago, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He is determined to do everything he can to remain in power, to keep his financial base in power in Moscow, supporting his regime, and to sow chaos and discontent in Europe, throughout Eurasia, and in the United States. And now President Trump may have to seriously reconsider his Russia strategy, which was originally, how do I find ways to work with Vladimir Putin, even while we have all these differences? But I think Vladimir Putin is making it very clear there's not going to be a lot of room for accommodation, compromise, or collaboration on some of the toughest issues around the world.
Right, it is sort of strange behavior, I guess. I guess specifically because neither the United States nor Russia wants to go to war with each other. We have mutually assured destruction. Everybody knows that. When you escalate tensions, how they've been escalating, first by poisoning that former Russian spy in the UK, which they had to know would be traced back to them because of the nerve agent that was used. Then they denied it. Then their diplomats were expelled from the UK. Then they were expelled from the US. And now they're expelling our diplomats from Russia. I mean, I guess what's their goal by escalating if they know that they don't want to go to war with us?
What's interesting, Liz, is that the Russians offered what we would call in diplomacies a reciprocal, proportionate response. The same number of diplomats that have been expelled by the United States and other European governments have been expelled by Russia from Russia, or consulates and embassies in Russia. What's going to be interesting, I believe, is what's going to be the response now on the Western side. What will President Trump and the U.S. government, along with our NATO allies, do as a next step? And I think there are a number of options for the United States to send a message to Russia that it is beyond the pale. I mean, this is a threshold event where the Russians are using a chemical agent, a weapon of mass destruction, on the sovereign territory of another country, in this case the United Kingdom, to assassinate people it finds distasteful. And I think the U.S. may be looking at options involving cyber warfare against Russian cyber operatives, perhaps economic sanctions against the oligarchs that help keep Vladimir Putin in power, and certainly military resources such as building up our NATO budget, maybe moving to see how we have tens of thousands of troops able to mass mobilize in response to a Russian provocation in a short amount of time, 30 days or so, as opposed to what might take 3 months or 6 months. And I think there'll be a number of options for President to consider in order to make sure that Vladimir Putin receives a disproportionate response from the United States to demonstrate that this kind of reckless behavior will not be accepted in any manner whatsoever.
Right, and I mean, that's where it becomes a tricky situation to me. And I know you're the expert here, but if we were to levy sanctions against Russia, if we were to launch some sort of cyber war with Russia, or we were to move our military installations so that we could respond quicker, all of your suggestions, that would be an escalation. We could expect a Russian response to that. And my question, I guess, and it's a repetition of my question from before, but where does that end? Because we know that the highest possible response here is we both have nuclear weapons. So where would something like this actually end?
I want to make sure that we're clear here that we're not talking about anything that anybody believes would lead to any type of a nuclear exchange. There are a range of options, hundreds of options that are available to both sides to very, very gradually ramp up, Liz. So I want to make sure that we're not talking about anything that is beyond the imagination. But the thing I think the end game for the president and the West is going to be collectively how to weaken Vladimir Putin in the eyes of the Russian people, because that's really the accommodation that's been made. The reason they're willing to support him, I mean, a lot of this involves Russian history and how they see the role of the strongman, whether it was a czar or a communist leader or now an autocrat like Vladimir Putin. But if the West can find ways to weaken Putin in the eyes of the average Russian voter or average citizen, and make clear that the deal that they've struck, that they'll support Vladimir Putin in exchange for security and some measure of prosperity, is going to be torn apart because of Putin's actions, that may in fact lead the oligarchs in the end to say, we need a different leader besides Vladimir Putin, a strong man, but not somebody who is constantly antagonizing the West and causing more problems for us than we're willing to accept. And I think that's going to have to be the endgame strategy beyond what President Trump has been trying to do in finding a way to establish a friendship with Putin, is to threaten Putin with the ability to build up opposition among oligarchs and among voters that can possibly end Vladimir Putin's reign on power far sooner than Putin is ready to concede.
Right, sort of a campaign to damage Putin's credibility. That's interesting. One last question. This is just a psychological question too. We don't have a ton of time here, but when Vladimir Putin, who surely knew about this attempted assassination of the former Russian spy in the UK, using this internationally banned nerve agent, why would they use that method in an attempted assassination if they know, and they had to know, that it could be traced back to them and only them since it was developed in Russia? Why would they do that?
It's a great question, and I don't know how to have a clear answer for you, Liz, but I'm going to take a stab at this. And I think part of what's happening here is Vladimir Putin is demonstrating to his people and to adversaries and allies of Russia's around the world that he feels so self-confident, so self-assured, so powerful, he is able to undertake the most reckless action, assassinating former Russian spies on the territory of European countries, just several hundred miles from Moscow's borders, from Russia's borders. That's how powerful he is. And I think he's very surprised by the collective response of the West, the very, very strong response by the Trump administration. I think this one really surprised him. And I don't know to what extent there's now an opportunity to try to close in on Putin and limit his options going forward. But I would, in fact, propose that President Trump use the momentum of these sanctions now and really move forward very, very quickly to push back against Putin far beyond what he ever expected.
Right, especially since this is a sort of a coalition of all these Western nations. It's not just unilaterally President Trump, but it sounds to me almost like an invincibility complex is what you're describing in Putin's case. Very interesting. John, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.